I was pouring my morning coffee when that red circle on my calendar stared back at me. "Dad, it's just a meeting," my son said. That night, the photos proved otherwise. His engagement party. My chair left empty. It stung, but I've learned to breathe before I speak. I kept my hands steady, my record straight. What they don't know. I saved their voicemails, and my late wife left a sealed addendum with our lawyer. If anyone conspires against me, they forfeit everything. Tomorrow. I open it in court. Let's see who still calls me old man after that. Stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. The kitchen was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. I sat at the old table, its surface scarred from years of family meals and projects I'd once built with my hands. The phone rang, sharp against the silence. I picked it up, expecting maybe a neighbor or an old friend checking in. Instead, it was my son, Daryl. His voice was quick, clipped, like he was calling from a crowded hallway. "Dad, it's just a meeting. Nothing special," he said. I paused, trying to catch the tone behind his words. A meeting? On a Friday evening? The way he rushed past the explanation left me unsettled. "A meeting?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, measured. "What kind of meeting needs you this late?" "Work stuff," he muttered. "You wouldn't be interested." I swallowed the urge to press further. Instead, I let the silence stretch. Over 70 years had taught me when words could push someone away faster than they were already retreating. But inside, my thoughts churned. I'd given decades to this boy, my weekends, my health, my patience. Yet here he was, brushing me off like I was a stranger. "I see," I said finally. "Well, good luck with your meeting." He was already gone before the sentence finished, the click on the line echoing louder than any slammed door. Later, I walked to the corner of the kitchen where my desk calendar hung crooked on the wall. I slid on my glasses, leaned close, and saw the red circle around Saturday. The handwriting wasn't mine, it was his, bold and uneven, marking the date like it meant something worth remembering. My chest tightened. If this was just a meeting, why would he mark it with such care? I searched through the mail piled nearby. Bills, flyers, nothing more, no invitation. No card. The house echoed with absence. I thought of Marjorie, my wife, gone 10 years now. She had always insisted that family milestones were sacred. Birthdays, graduations, even small victories. She made them occasions. I could almost hear her voice now, teasing Daryl for being too casual, reminding him of the value of family presence. That memory was a knife, gentle but sharp. Without her here, the silence carried more weight. The next morning I tried to occupy myself. I watered the plants in the window, trimmed the browning leaves that drooped despite the sunlight. I walked out to my workshop, brushing dust off tools that hadn't been used in years. Each movement was slow, deliberate, but it only underlined the loneliness that hung around me. I glanced out at the street. Neighbors bustled, loading cars with picnic baskets, children tugging on sleeves, laughter spilling into the air. Their lives brimmed with togetherness. Mine felt like the echo of something I once had. I caught myself staring at the red circle again. The question returned, sharp and insistent. Why mark a simple meeting in red? My son wasn't careful about details unless they mattered. I shook my head, pressing my lips together. Something wasn't right. By evening, the air carried a cool bite. I opened the fridge, its light spilling across the quiet kitchen. On the top shelf rested a bottle of wine, dusty but intact. I had saved it years ago for a special occasion, thinking someday I'd open it with Daryl, maybe toast to his success or to the family he might one day build. I touched the bottle, fingers lingering, then pulled back. Not tonight, not for this. I sat down again, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. A heaviness pressed against me. Not just suspicion, but the sting of exclusion. Still, I refused to jump to conclusions. I'd lived long enough to know that rushing to judgment could wound more than it healed. But doubt doesn't leave easily. It grows roots in the quiet, demanding answers. If it's just a meeting, I whispered to the empty room, then why does it feel like I'm not meant to be there? I rose, reaching for my coat on the rack. My hand trembled slightly, though not from the cold. Something deeper stirred, a truth I couldn't name but couldn't ignore either. I steadied myself, gripping the fabric tightly. Whatever this so-called meeting was, it carried weight I wasn't meant to share. Morning crept into my apartment, pale light sliding across the floorboards. I sat at the small desk tucked into the corner, my old computer humming as it woke. My hands hovered over the keyboard longer than I'd like to admit. Something about that red circle on the calendar refused to leave me alone, against my better judgment. I opened the browser and typed Daryl's name into the search bar. A registry popped up almost immediately, his and Valerie's names in bold at the top. My chest tightened as I scrolled. Silverware sets, cookware, bed linens. It was all there, a neat list for their future life together. Next to each item was a note of who had already contributed. The Andersons down the block, the couple from church, even acquaintances I barely remembered. My eyes scanned the names again, slower this time. Mine wasn't there, not once. For a moment I just stared at the screen, numb, then disbelief struck like a blow. My neighbors, people with no blood ties to my son, had been invited to celebrate this milestone, and me, his father, left in the shadows. My throat felt dry. A small laugh escaped me, but it wasn't humor, only disbelief curdled into something heavier. After a long while, I leaned back, rubbed my temples, and whispered to myself, "So this is the meeting." Resignation settled like dust on my shoulders. By noon, the unanswered questions gnawed too fiercely. I picked up the phone, dialing the number for the venue I had scribbled down years ago for another event. The receptionist answered cheerfully. "Good afternoon. Pembroke Hall. This is Travis." "Hello, Travis?" I said, steadying my voice. "I was wondering if you might check a reservation for me. The name's Daryl Rader." A few clicks of keys, then a pause. "Yes, Mr. Rader reserved a large hall for this Saturday. It says, engagement celebration." My heart plummeted. There it was. Plain and undeniable. My son hadn't just omitted me, he had lied outright. I took a breath, forcing composure. "Thank you kindly, Travis. That's all I needed." He offered polite well wishes, but I hardly heard. The phone felt heavier as I placed it down, the sound of the receiver settling back more final than it should have been. I sat there, listening to the silence in my apartment, letting the truth settle until it carved its place inside me. Later that day, I walked the familiar streets of my neighborhood. Families bustled with weekend plans, children skipping rope, mothers calling out for coats, fathers loading trunks with picnic baskets. Each sight pricked at me, reminding me of what once was mine. Marjorie always said, "Family's the one thing you can trust." Luther, "Don't ever doubt it." Her voice, remembered, hurt more now than any stranger's slight could. Trust. What a brittle word when left in the hands of your own child. I paused at the corner, watching a young couple holding hands, their faces lit with plans and possibility. The ache sharpened. If Daryl had truly believed it was nothing special, why hide it? Why make sure I was the one person left outside the door? That question circled in my head with no answer, pressing harder with each step home. Night fell. I poured a small drink, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as I lowered myself into the chair near Marjorie's photo. Her smile in the frame seemed to look straight at me, as if expecting me to speak. I leaned forward, my voice low. "They didn't forget me, Marge. They erased me. Like I don't belong in their new world." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sipped slowly, my thoughts heavy. The more I tried to reason it away, the clearer it became. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. When I finally closed the laptop that night, the glow of the screen fading, my eyes drifted once more to the calendar. That red circle blazed brighter than ever in my mind. A mark I couldn't erase no matter how hard I tried. The next morning, sunlight streamed across my kitchen table, catching the rim of my mug as I poured myself a strong cup of black coffee. The quiet felt heavier than usual. I carried the mug to the chair by the window, settling in the spot where I often started my day with the paper. Instead of newsprint, I pulled out my phone, its screen glowing against the early light. That was when Ellis's little face filled the screen, my grandson calling me on FaceTime. "Grandpa," he squealed, his voice full of life. "Daddy and Valerie looked so happy last night." The words hit me like a punch I never saw coming. My coffee nearly slipped from my hand. I steadied the cup on the table and tried to mask the storm in my chest. "Last night?" I asked gently, forcing calm into my voice. Ellis nodded, innocent, oblivious. "Yeah, at the big party. Everybody was there. They had balloons and a big cake. Daddy said it was the best night ever." My heart sank. So it had already happened. Not only was I not invited, but the whole celebration had gone on without me, without even a call or a mention. The sting was deeper than anything I'd felt in years. It wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. "Sounds like you had fun," I managed to say, forcing a smile for his sake. When the call ended, the silence returned. But it wasn't the quiet of a house. It was the quiet of being erased. I leaned back, closing my eyes. Marjorie's voice rose unbidden in my memory. She had always been the glue that kept us close, years ago, on our anniversary. She placed her hand on Daryl's shoulder and made him promise never to shut me out of his life. I could still hear her soft words. "Family means you hold the door open, no matter what storms are outside." Now, with her gone, that promise had been shattered. My voice cracked as I whispered into the empty room. "You broke your mother's promise, Daryl." Saying it aloud made the betrayal sharper, grief mixing with anger that refused to quiet. The phone rang again. I hesitated before picking it up. Sylvia Carmen's familiar voice poured through, warm and casual. "Luther, I just wanted to check. Why weren't you at the big engagement party last night? Everyone was wondering where you were." For a moment, I couldn't find my words. My grip tightened on the phone. I swallowed hard, then forced out. "I was busy." My voice was steady enough, but inside it felt like shards of glass. Sylvia chatted a bit more, not sensing the wound she'd just pressed on, before saying goodbye. When I put the phone down, the weight of humiliation pressed harder than ever. Not only my family, but the entire community knew I wasn't there. They celebrated, toasted, laughed, and I was reduced to a question mark, a missing figure no one thought to include. The evening stretched long. I sat in my chair, replaying Daryl's words in my mind. Just a meeting. Over and over they echoed, each repetition more bitter than the last. My voice trembled as I muttered them into the air, trying to understand how my son had reduced me to an afterthought. And the phone sat on the table within reach. My hand hovered above it, fingers curling with indecision. Part of me longed to call him, to demand answers, but another part knew the cost. Speaking could tear us apart for good, yet silence was no different. "If I stay quiet," I whispered to the empty room, "I let them erase me. If I speak, I risk losing him forever, but silence already feels like death." My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at Daryl's name on the screen. My finger hovered, frozen. The whole apartment was so quiet. I could hear the rhythm of my own heartbeat urging me toward a choice I wasn't sure I was ready to make. My finger finally pressed the screen. The dial tone filled the room, steady and cold. Then Daryl's voice came through, casual, almost cheerful, as though nothing had happened. "Hey, Dad, everything okay?" I steadied my breath. "Why wasn't I invited? Daryl?" My tone was calm, but the words cut like steel. There was a pause. I could almost hear the shuffle of movement on his end. Then he chuckled nervously. "It was a last-minute thing. You know, nothing planned, just a gathering." Behind him, faint but unmistakable, I heard a woman's whisper, "Valerie." She was guiding his words, pressing him into excuses. My jaw tightened. "Don't play me for a fool," I said evenly. "You circled the date weeks ago." He exhaled sharply, irritation creeping in. "Dad, It wasn't that big a deal, really. You don't need to make it into one. Lies weigh heavier than truth, son, I told him. The silence on the line was thick, strained. That struck him. His voice sharpened. You wouldn't have fit in. Dad, it was mostly Valerie's side. Younger people. You'd just be uncomfortable. I closed my eyes, remembering the nights I carried him through fevers, the mornings I showed up at every ball game, even when I was bone-tired from the workshop. I'd been his shadow, his shield, and now he cast me aside like an old coat. I've stood by you every step of your life, I said slowly, but you couldn't stand by me for one night. His breathing quickened. He didn't answer. Then, with a click, the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the phone in my hand as though it had betrayed me. 2 hours slipped by, the walls of the apartment pressing closer. Then, a buzz broke the stillness. A text. Grandpa, I wish you were here last night. It felt wrong without you. Rowan. I read the message again and again, my grandson's words carved through the despair Daryl had left me with. Rowan saw me, felt my absence. In that moment, he was my anchor, a reminder that not every branch of the family tree had rotted. The night deepened. I sat in my chair, the lamplight casting long shadows across Marjorie's photo. Her smile was steady, kind, but it seemed to ask a question. Will you let them erase you? I whispered back. No, Marjorie, not while I draw breath. A knock startled me. Firm, deliberate. I rose slowly, each step heavy with the weight of the day, and opened the door. Standing there was Father Glenn Darnell, his expression grave, a parish bulletin tucked under his arm. He held it out gently. My eyes caught the headline. Congratulations to Daryl Rader and Valerie Cuff on their engagement. Even the church knew before I did. Father Glenn's eyes met mine, full of pity, but pity was the last thing I wanted from the world. By morning, the whispers had reached me before I even stepped out the door. Mrs. Lang from across the street leaned on her railing, her voice carrying just enough to be heard. Oh, what a night it must have been. That ballroom looked gorgeous in the photos. Another neighbor chimed in, laughing about the champagne fountain, the music, the speeches. I kept walking, shoulders squared, pretending not to hear, though every word sank deeper. Inside my apartment, I forced myself to sit at the computer. Curiosity burned in me like a fever. With a few clicks, I saw what they were talking about. Posts, smiling faces, the gleam of chandeliers. There was my son, Daryl, raising a glass beside Valerie, her hand sparkling with a new diamond. The comments scrolled endlessly. What a beautiful couple. What a perfect night. I imagined the clinking glasses, the toasts echoing, the laughter bouncing off the ballroom walls. In my mind's eye, I saw the place where I should have been seated, at his side, the father who built him, the man who carried his weight until he could stand on his own. The sting of absence was sharper than any insult spoken aloud. I closed my eyes and remembered the years, paying tuition when Daryl swore he'd make me proud, buying his first set of tools for a summer job he gave up after 2 weeks, standing in the rain to watch him play ball, smiling even when he lost. Every sacrifice had been an investment in him. Now, my return was exclusion. Later that afternoon, a message arrived from a mutual friend, someone who hadn't realized I'd been kept away. Thought you'd like to see this, the note read, and attached was a candid photograph. The camera had caught one table in particular, perfectly arranged with plates, glasses, a centerpiece glowing with candles. And there it was, one chair, conspicuously empty, its back turned slightly as though no one dared touch it. I stared at it until my chest ached. Whether accident or intention, it screamed louder than words. That chair was mine. The seat I had earned with years of fatherhood, stripped away in a single night. My lips barely moved as I whispered, that chair was mine. The apartment closed in on me when evening fell. I poured a glass of red wine, the kind Marjorie used to open on anniversaries. I sat at the table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, silence so heavy it pressed into my bones. Somewhere across the city, Glasses clinked and laughter roared. But here, only solitude answered back. I lifted the glass toward Marjorie's photograph, her smile frozen forever. "Here's to the family we raised," I said, voice rough. The bitterness burned as I swallowed. But inside, something shifted. If they thought they could erase me so easily, they were mistaken. I would not let silence finish me. My phone buzzed again. "Rowan." "Grandpa, it felt wrong without you." I kept looking at the empty seat. I gripped the phone, a tear breaking loose, sliding unchecked. Not only sorrow, gratitude, too. Gratitude that one soul, young though he was, noticed. He saw what his father chose to ignore. That recognition lit a small fire inside me, faint but steady. I set the glass aside, pulled a notepad toward me, and picked up my pen. My hand trembled, but I began to write. Words spilled out. Anger, hurt, the truth they tried to bury. If they'd turned my love into a ghost, then my silence would have to thunder louder than their toasts. The pen scratched across the paper, and as it did, I realized this wasn't a letter of surrender. It was the first mark of defiance. The pen shook in my hand as I wrote the first words of a letter I never thought I'd need to write. The morning light streamed through the blinds as I sat across from my lawyer, Mr. Hanley. The letter I had written the night before lay on his polished oak desk, my handwriting uneven but firm. He read each line carefully, lips pressed into a thin line, then looked up with a weight in his eyes I didn't want to see. "Luther," he said slowly, "this isn't just about feelings anymore. When families start excluding someone this deliberately, it often isn't only about parties or appearances, it's about control, property, inheritance." The words dropped like stones. My hands clenched on the armrests. "Are you saying my own son is maneuvering to cut me out?" He leaned back, folding his glasses. "I've seen it too many times. A parent trusted, sidelined, then stripped of, say, over what's theirs. That letter, it's more than testimony, it's protection. Vindication coursed through me, sharp as a blade, but so did terror. Betrayal wasn't confined to the heart. It could empty your pockets, silence your name, erase your rights." I nodded, steadying my voice. "If Darrell thinks I'll stand idle, he's mistaken. I built this life brick by brick. No one steals it from me." Leaving the office, the city noise felt harsher than usual, the horns sharper, the chatter colder. The world had tilted, and I had to find my footing fast. At home, I slipped off my coat, dropped my keys on the table, and pressed play on my old answering machine. The familiar voice of Jonas Quiles rambled in a message, but midway it changed. A shuffle. Then background noise. Music faint. Glasses clinking. Voices cutting through. My heart stopped when I recognized Darrell. "Dad's too stubborn," he said, half laughing. Valerie's voice followed. Lower. Certain. "That's why he doesn't need to know anything. The less he knows, the easier it is." I froze. Proof. Not just neglect, not oversight, deliberate exclusion. My stomach knotted, but inside me something ignited. They had spoken the truth without knowing they were being recorded. And now their own words would defend me. I replayed it twice, each time feeling my chest tighten. Then I printed the transcript, the paper sliding warm from the machine. I placed it carefully in the folder beside the letter. Evidence, a shield, and perhaps a sword. Marjorie's voice echoed in memory, from some long ago night when we'd talked after supper. "Protect yourself, Luther. Even from family, if they forget what love means." She had known the world could sour even under your own roof. I ran my hand over her photograph on the shelf and whispered, "You were right, Marjorie. It's not about a party. It's about my dignity, my future." The house was quiet until the phone rang again. Rowan's name lit up the screen. My grandson's voice was hushed, almost conspiratorial. "Grandpa, can I come by tomorrow?" "Of course," I answered. "Why?" He hesitated, then whispered, "I heard Dad and Valerie arguing at the party. They mentioned the will. I don't think they wanted me to hear." My grip tightened on the receiver. The suspicion I had feared most slid into focus. They weren't just erasing me from photographs and guest lists, they were targeting what I'd worked a lifetime for. My voice was low, steady. Rowan, you just told me what I feared the most. When the call ended, I placed the transcript and the letter together in a drawer, locking it with a decisive click. I sat back, breath heavy but controlled. The battle lines had been drawn, not in the streets or the courts yet, but inside the walls of my own bloodline. I placed the folder of evidence in my drawer, knowing war had just begun inside my own bloodline. Rowan arrived at my doorstep just as the evening shadows stretched long across the porch. His face was pale, his eyes restless, and he clutched his phone as if it carried proof of something too heavy for him to hold alone. I led him inside, set a glass of water on the table, and waited. He didn't waste time. "Grandpa," he said, his voice trembling, "they're saying things about you. At the party. I overheard Dad and Valerie. They were telling people you're losing your memory, that you forget bills, dates. They said you're unfit to handle your estate." The words struck me like a blow. For years I'd been the one steady hand in this family, paying tuition, fixing roofs, holding everyone together. Now my own son was twisting my age into a weapon. My jaw clenched, but I forced myself to look Rowan in the eye. "Did you hear it clearly?" I asked. Rowan nodded, tears glistening. "I swear it. They want people to think you can't be trusted anymore." Shock gave way to rage, burning hot in my chest. Betrayal no longer lived in the shadows. It had marched into the daylight, carrying my dignity as its prize. I placed a hand on Rowan's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me. Don't let anyone make you doubt what you heard. This isn't about my memory, it's about control, and they're playing a dangerous game." By Sunday, I forced myself to church, though every step felt heavier than the last. Father Glenn greeted me warmly, but as we shook hands, he leaned close. His voice carried the kind of caution reserved for confessions. "Luther, I've been hearing things. Daryl's been saying you've missed payments, mixed up dates. Folks are whispering. It was confirmation. Bitter and undeniable. My own son had chosen gossip as his weapon." I steadied my voice. "Father, have I ever failed to keep my word with you?" He looked at me with sadness. "Never." "Then remember that when you hear these lies," I said quietly. Outwardly calm, inwardly I was steel. I would not be erased while breath still filled my lungs. Later that afternoon, as I walked back through the neighborhood, Mrs. Kellen, a well-meaning neighbor, stopped me by the hedge. "Luther," she said gently, "maybe you should think about a nursing home. I heard Valerie say it might be best." Her tone carried pity, but pity cut sharper than contempt. I managed to smile. "I'll consider it when I can't climb these steps anymore. Not before." She nodded, unaware of the dagger she had carried on her tongue. Back inside, I pulled the drawer open and began documenting. Every word Rowan heard, every whisper Father Glenn mentioned, every careless suggestion from neighbors, I typed, printed, and filed. Silence, I realized, would no longer guard me. Silence would bury me. That evening, unable to sit still, I dialed Sylvia. Her voice was cautious, as though she already knew what was weighing on me. "Luther," she said, "I didn't know if I should tell you this. At the engagement party, I saw Valerie whispering to the staff. She told them you were unpredictable. She warned them you might cause a scene if you showed up." My chest tightened. Every move had been deliberate, rehearsed, and painted in public. They hadn't just kept me out of the room. They'd written the story of my supposed downfall before I even had a chance to speak. "They want to paint me senile before the ink dries on my will," I whispered, more to myself than to her. Sylvia sighed, sorrow heavy in her breath. "I'm sorry, Luther. I thought you should know." When the call ended, I stared at the folder on my desk, the weight of it heavier than stone. The next strike, I realized, would not be whispers but papers, cold, legal, stamped with my name. The invitation came reluctantly, as if shoved into an envelope by hands that wished it could disappear before reaching me. Sylvia's insistence and Father Glenn's quiet persuasion had forced Darrell and Valerie to extend it, though I knew in my bones it wasn't goodwill. When I stepped into Valerie's cousin's sprawling suburban home that evening, the hum of whispered voices prickled the back of my neck. Eyes tracked me as though I had been summoned not as family, but as a defendant. The air reeked of perfume and unease. A long dining table gleamed under chandelier light, but no one offered me a seat until Sylvia rose and pulled out a chair herself. I sat down, back straight, letting silence be my armor. Valerie began with her soft, calculated voice. "We all know Dad's been under a lot of stress," she said, hands folded as if she were hosting a prayer circle. "Darrell and I believe it's time we help manage the family's finances. It's only to relieve him, to make sure nothing slips." "Slips?" I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. I reached into my leather folder and slid out papers across the table. Bank statements, notarized letters from my accountant, even a copy of Marjorie's will. "These are current, accurate, and verified. Nothing has slipped." Murmurs rippled. Valerie's face crumpled into a mask of wounded innocence. "I was only thinking of your health," she whispered, her eyes darting toward Darrell. Darrell slammed his hand on the table. "You don't trust your own son? After everything?" I stared at him steadily. "Trust is earned, Darrell, not demanded." The room bristled. Aunts exchanged worried glances. Uncles folded their arms. For a moment, it seemed their version of the story might overpower me. Then Rowan's voice cut through the tension. "Stop lying," he said, standing so suddenly his chair scraped against the floor. "I heard you. Valerie, you rehearsed what to say with Travis. The staff at the venue. You practiced how to tell everyone Grandpa was confused." Gasps spread across the room. Valerie shook her head furiously. "That's absurd." But Sylvia rose as well. "I saw you whispering to staff before the party. Valerie, I heard you say Luther might cause a scene. Don't pretend otherwise." Father Glenn, seated quietly until now, folded his hands. "I've spoken with Luther often. He is clear-minded. He remembers details better than most men half his age. These rumors are poison." The tide shifted. Relatives who moments earlier stared at me with suspicion now studied Darrell and Valerie with unease. Whispers no longer circled me. They circled them. Darrell's composure cracked. "Rowan, you've been brainwashed. You don't know what you're saying." His voice rose. Desperate, Valerie clutched her phone, waving it like a shield. "We have proof. He's made mistakes. I can show you." "Play this first," I interrupted, sliding my own phone onto the table. Jonas's voicemail, saved and protected, filled the room with Darrell's own voice. "It's not a party, just a meeting. Dad doesn't need to know." The words echoed off the walls. Silence crashed down. Valerie's hand froze. Darrell's face drained of color. Every eye turned to him. For the first time in his life, my son could not look at me. The morning light filtered weakly through my kitchen blinds, casting pale stripes across the table where I sat with a cooling mug of coffee. My hands wrapped around the cup, though I'd long stopped drinking. The night before had torn the fabric of my family, and now the silence in my house pressed against my chest harder than any argument. My phone kept vibrating, first one call, then another. Cousin Gina left a voicemail, apologizing for ever doubting me. Then Uncle Frank called, his voice sharp, telling me I had humiliated my own son. Each ring was another reminder that the family tree had been split right down the trunk, and I was at the center of the fracture. For every apology, there was a rebuke. I sat there, drained, staring at Marjorie's photo on the counter, whispering, "You warned me it might come to this." By mid-morning, Rowan arrived, Ellis bouncing beside him with a baseball cap askew. Rowan looked uneasy, almost guilty. "Grandpa," he said, "I hope I didn't go too far last night. Maybe I should have kept quiet." I shook my head. "No, Rowan, you spoke the truth. Truth doesn't need apology." Ellis piped up, his young voice cutting through the tension. "Grandpa, are you still coming to my game? Coach says we need you in the bleachers." His eyes held nothing but innocence. No politics, no sides. That question nearly undid me. Of course, I told him, forcing a smile. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Rowan sat down, lowering his voice. They won't stop here. Valerie was furious after everyone turned on her. She's going to push this further. I nodded slowly. I know, and I need to be ready. Gratitude and dread swirled inside me, thankful for their loyalty, fearful of what Daryl and Valerie might unleash next. By afternoon, the mailman dropped an envelope thick with formality. The letter inside bore the stamp of a law office I didn't recognize. As I read, my chest tightened. Valerie's attorney questioned my mental competency, suggesting a guardianship transfer might be in the family's best interest. My jaw clenched. This was no longer whispers in church halls or gossip around dining tables. It was a direct attack, dressed in legal stationery. I phoned Sylvia, my voice steady though my pulse thundered. They've moved to paper. A lawyer's letter. They want control. Don't face it alone, she urged. You need counsel of your own, someone who'll fight for you. Father Glenn echoed the same when I told him later. Guard yourself, Luther. The truth is with you, but truth must be carried by strong hands. The betrayal deepened, but so did my resolve. Valerie's mask of kindness had finally cracked into naked hostility, and Daryl was letting it happen. That evening, I sat at my desk again, listening once more to Jonas's voicemail. Daryl's words about the meeting filled the room like a warning siren, proof, clear and undeniable. I replayed it twice, then 3 times, as if reminding myself I wasn't imagining any of this. While organizing the folder of evidence, my fingers brushed against an old envelope tucked into Marjorie's will. I hadn't noticed it in years. Inside was her handwriting, delicate, steady. Protect your dignity, no matter what, the note read. I held it for a long while, eyes burning. She must have known, somehow, that a day like this could come. Her words were both comfort and command. I rose, slid the note into my pocket, and whispered aloud to the empty room, I won't let them bury me before my time. The rain had been steady all evening, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that made the house feel even lonelier. I sat at my desk, the lamplight spilling over Valerie's legal notice. Every sentence on that page was another attempt to strip me of who I was. I spread out a notepad and began writing down everything I owned, house, savings, bonds, the few heirlooms Marjorie had treasured. The list grew longer than I had realized, and the more I wrote, the clearer it became why they wanted me silenced. Rowan lingered by the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't interrupt, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching the weight of years settle on my shoulders. When I finally looked up, he said softly, Grandpa, they're scared because they know you still hold the keys. His words gave me clarity. They weren't just trying to sideline me. They wanted control. The following afternoon, I met Sylvia at a small diner on the edge of town. The smell of fried onions clung to the air, and rainwater streaked down the windows as we slid into a booth. She leaned forward, her voice low. You can't go to anyone tied to Daryl or Valerie. I've seen too many family friends who bend when money's waved their way. She scribbled a few names on a napkin, men and women she trusted from her own years in community work. Then she looked me straight in the eye. Luther, you need to know. Valerie was asking about power of attorney forms months before that party. She was laying groundwork long before you ever heard the word guardianship. Her words struck me like a blow. So this wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate. I stirred my coffee but didn't drink. So all of this, I muttered, was in motion before I even realized the first crack in the wall. Sylvia reached across the table, resting her hand on mine. Don't let them twist this. You're not weak. You're being hunted. Later that evening, Father Glenn came by, his umbrella dripping on my porch. He sat across from me, calm as ever, reminding me of the confessions Marjorie once whispered in fear, that Daryl might someday grow greedy. I stared at the carpet, guilt rising in my throat. Had I enabled this by giving too much too easily? Glenn shook his head. Kindness isn't weakness, Luther, but there are those who mistake it for an open vault. Our heavy talk was broken when Ellis bounded into the room, holding a poster board covered in markers and cut-out pictures. "Grandpa, it's my school project about family. Can you help me glue these?" His smile erased the gloom, if only for a moment. I knelt beside him, pressing glue to paper, grateful for the reminder that not all bonds had been poisoned, but the reprieve was brief. 2 days later, I sat across from an attorney Sylvia had recommended. He was sharp, direct, and unafraid. "If they want to drag this through court, you'll be ready," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. For the first time in weeks, I felt a measure of ground beneath my feet. That night, as I sat at home with stacks of papers in front of me, the phone rang. Jonas's voice buzzed through the receiver. "I think you'll want this," he said. "I kept a copy of that voicemail from Daryl. You should hear it." When the recording played, Daryl's voice cut through the static, cruel in its certainty. The engagement party was just to lock down Valerie's influence over the old man. My grip tightened around the phone. Proof, finally, undeniable proof, was in my hands. The room went quiet when the message ended. I laid the phone down, every muscle taut with resolve. "If Daryl wants war," I whispered into the silence, "then he'll have one." The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and damp wool coats, the kind of scent that always reminded me of winters past. I clutched the small recorder in my pocket. Jonas's voicemail saved inside. A piece of truth I couldn't afford to lose. My attorney walked beside me, his calm stride a stark contrast to the storm in my chest. As we entered the wide hallway, I saw Daryl and Valerie striding in together. Their heads were held high, their eyes sliding over me as if I were a relic, already written off. Valerie's smirk lingered just long enough to sting. Daryl buttoned his jacket like a man preparing for a photo, not a courtroom battle. I forced myself to breathe evenly, reminding myself that fear couldn't be my face to the world. I straightened my shoulders, nodded to my lawyer, and kept walking toward the chamber doors. Inside, the room hummed with whispered conversations until the bailiff called for order. Valerie's lawyer stood first, his voice smooth, rehearsed. He spoke of my age, of the grief I'd endured since Marjorie's passing, of bills supposedly forgotten and dates confused. Each word dripped with condescension. I sat still, though my hands trembled under the table. When I felt the weight of despair pressing down, I closed my eyes briefly and pictured Marjorie, her steady hands, her unwavering gaze. She had carried me through darker nights than this. Rowan sat in the gallery. Ellis perched beside him, swinging his legs nervously. Their presence was a balm, though I hated that Ellis's young eyes were forced to see his family fracture in such a place. I turned my head just enough to meet Rowan's gaze. He gave me a slight nod, and I let the anger simmer into focus. I wasn't here to collapse. I was here to stand. When my lawyer rose, his words carried no theatrics. He simply pressed a button, and Jonas's recording filled the chamber. Daryl's voice spilled into the silence. The engagement party was just to lock down Valerie's influence over the old man. The phrase hung heavy, undeniable. Gasps broke from the benches. Valerie's composure cracked. Her eyes widened, then narrowed into daggers. Daryl shifted in his chair, his face flushing, his hands gripping the armrests as though he might bolt. Before the murmur settled, another figure stood, Travis Holcomb, the young man who had worked the party venue. None of us had expected him here. He cleared his throat, voice shaking but firm. "I saw Valerie give instructions that night," he said. "She told us to make sure Mr. Bianchi didn't get past the lobby. It wasn't an accident he wasn't there. It was deliberate." The silence afterward was suffocating. Even the judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Valerie tried to object, but her protest sounded shrill, brittle. The air in the room shifted, doubt creeping into faces that had looked certain a moment before. For the first time, I saw the foundation of their lies quake. The judge tapped his gavel, restoring order. His voice was measured but final. This case would not be decided today. It would move to a full trial. The words were both relief and burden. The ordeal would stretch longer. dragging my name and dignity through more mud before resolution. As the session ended, Valerie stormed out, her heels striking the marble floor like hammers. Darrell trailed behind, his gaze glued to the ground. He couldn't meet my eyes. Rowan came to me, his hand gripping my shoulder. "Whatever it takes, Grandpa," he whispered. "We'll stand with you." When I stepped out into the cold Boston air, the city noise felt distant, muffled by the echo of the gavel still ringing in my head. I paused on the steps, the recorder still heavy in my pocket. The fight was far from over, I muttered to myself, steady and sure. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The courthouse was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters whispered at the back, and the murmur of voices rose like a low tide. I sat at the table with my attorney, my heart beating with a rhythm that was steady but heavy, like a drum calling me into battle. Across the aisle, Darrell and Valerie looked smug, polished in new suits and flanked by their expensive legal team. Their laughter in the hallway had been loud enough to carry. They believed today would end with me stripped of control, humiliated before everyone. I bowed my head for a moment, whispering in silence to Marjorie. "This is for us," I said under my breath. "For what we built together, for what they've tried to tear apart." When I lifted my eyes again, I wasn't the old man they painted me to be. I was a husband defending his wife's legacy, a father refusing to vanish quietly. The judge called the session to order. Valerie's lawyer strode to the front, voice smooth as oil. He began reading emails, each one dripping with arrogance. The words displayed on the screen made the room stir, exchanges between Darrell and Valerie plotting how to declare me incompetent, how to siphon control of the estate, how to keep me occupied while they managed real business. I sat rigid, my jaw clenched, but inside me a storm raged. Then Rowan rose from the gallery. His voice was steady, proud. "My grandfather raised me like his own son," he said, looking directly at the judge. "He taught me integrity, hard work, and the value of family. He is no burden. He is our strength. If you take away his dignity, you take away the heart of our family." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Ellis sat beside him, clutching his baseball cap, his eyes wide with loyalty only a child can show. The judge leaned forward, studying me, studying them. Pride swelled in my chest, pride that carried pain and love in equal measure. Then came the moment no one expected. My attorney stepped forward with a sealed envelope, aged but intact. He explained it was an addendum to Marjorie's will, filed years earlier and only now retrieved from the court's archives. He handed it to the judge, who opened it with deliberate care. The words he read made the air vanish from the room. "If any heir of mine conspires against my husband Luther, seeking to diminish his rights or dignity, that heir shall forfeit their inheritance in full." Gasps erupted like a wave. Valerie shot to her feet, her voice breaking. "This is a trick. She never—" Darrell slammed his fist against the table, red-faced, his lawyer trying to quiet him, but it was too late. Their conspiracy had written their own downfall. I closed my eyes, whispering softly. "You thought I was weak. You forgot who built this family." Marjorie had spoken from beyond, and her voice thundered louder than their schemes ever could. The judge struck his gavel, his ruling firm. I retained full control of my estate. Valerie and Darrell, by Marjorie's hand, were disinherited. Their protests rang hollow, drowned by the reality they had brought on themselves. When the session ended, Rowan rushed to me, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. Ellis took my hand, his grip small but strong. "We're with you, Grandpa," he whispered. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe deeply. Later, as dusk settled over Boston, I walked alone by the Charles River. The water glimmered in the fading light, carrying reflections of a city that had seen triumph and betrayal alike. I thought of Marjorie, of the sacrifices and the scars, of the family I had lost and the ones who remained true. I turned slightly, as if speaking to those who might listen beyond the courtroom walls. My voice trembled, but the words were steady. If you are blessed with family who still honors you, cherish them. If not, stand tall anyway, because dignity is the inheritance no one can steal. That evening, I walked home not as a broken old man, but as a father who had finally spoken the last word.